Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit about inclusion in health research. Now, health research has the potential to offer tremendous benefits. In fact, it's the major way in which we can, in an informed way, move forward with improving health for our communities. However, we know that those benefits are not being distributed equally. So there's a big question here that we need to ask around how do we do health research and evidence-based practice in a way that benefits all members of our communities. Now, nursing is a field that is based in social justice and equity. And there's a huge amount of nursing research that really focuses in on this question. That being said, it's quite common for research method classes to address these justice issues somewhat tangentially. I've looked at a lot of nursing research textbooks, and I don't think I've seen any textbook that has more than a couple paragraphs on the topic of justice, and often not even really talking about social justice. And I think that as we observe these major health disparities that are persistent in our communities, where a difference of location or a difference of race can mean 10 years of difference in lifespan, we really have to ask the question of what are we doing that needs to change to ensure that everybody gains a benefit from this and that some of these systemic problems. And given that research is the basis of evidence-based practice, it's the basis of what we do in health fields, that we should be really founding our work in that evidence base. What is it about that evidence base that maybe is not giving us the answers that we need to really answer these questions well? So these lectures are really an attempt to start thinking about those questions. Now, it won't offer all the answers. It's going to give some suggestions about ways to think about this. I have done my best to assemble some different types of ideas that sort of talk about the different elements to this. I will acknowledge that this isn't my area of expertise, and a lot of what I'm going to be sharing really is indebted to members of marginalized communities who've done work and thought about this and said, hey, this is not working for a large range of different reasons, and we really need to shift how we're doing things. So I don't want to take credit for these ideas. They are very much ones that come out of a history of advocacy in health professions to really shift our approaches. So the first thing I would like to say is, we need to think a little bit about research in the context of what it means in relationship to these socio-political inequities, right? Talk about how that connects, what that connection is between those elements. I also want to talk a little bit about historically what individuals, what groups research has tended to benefit, and how we think about that in our current context. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how research impacts different groups, particularly marginalized groups. And then go into a conversation about what some different strategies that are out there for addressing this, and talk about two different examples of that. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up by talking a little bit about evidence-based practice and some of the things that we might be able to do as we're trying to apply research to changing our practice that might be effective for reducing the risk that the changes that we make might make health disparities worse, or not produce the benefit that it potentially could. So let's talk a little bit about research and socio-political inequities. When we think about research, we often, as I've mentioned, we often focus in on the technicalities, that center component where we talk about data and we talk about, crunching numbers and stuff like that. And this, approach can sometimes appear on the surface to be objective, but the reality is that it isn't, right? The questions that we ask and the ways that we explore and discover things come out of, the motivations from ourselves and our community and our background, who's already done the work that we're basing our scholarship in. There's also, in science, we have this whole area of community feedback and analysis where, individual papers don't do a whole lot. It's really the whole field set of literature in an area that tells us something about an area. And if the people who are doing the analysis of that information are not representative of the whole population, there's power dynamics there. And then there's a whole fact that, research really interacts with the practice side of things. It does lead to changing policies. It leads to building knowledge and addressing the societal issues. And those things are deeply social. How that happens, how those changes play out are embedded in our culture. And the point here that I'm just trying to make is that all the different challenges that we have, sociopolitical challenges that we have in society, various types of discrimination, biases, etc., all those things come into play in the scientific process. It does not exist independent of culture. It's part of culture. And so we have to take a critical look at the scientific process as we're thinking about it, and really push back about any ideas that that's purely objective and absent all these different potential concerns. And many of those concerns that we're thinking about here are related to equity, where we're seeing huge health disparities in our communities. Now, I want to talk a little about intersectionality and power imbalances. Now, intersectionality is an idea that you may be familiar from other areas. I'm not going to go into it in great depth, but essentially it's pointing out the idea that we have a lot of different groupings of power dynamics in our culture that center around different identities, be it race, ethnicity, gender identity, class, etc. Right? There's many different factors. Now, these factors don't exist independently. Individuals carry multiple identities within them, and they interact to influence our access to healthcare, the way that we approach healthcare, prevention, all these different elements that are important for our overall health. And understanding that interaction is crucial. Now, research plays a very important role in this. First off, research is often used to define and categorize and explain these power dynamics, right? So when we talk about race, ethnicity, or gender identity, we have a lot of numbers that we use, a lot of data that we use to describe them in these contexts. And some of that data also supports and demonstrates this idea of intersectionality, that when you hold multiple identities, where you experience marginalization, you're more likely to have negative health impacts, right? So that's a positive thing. It's a double-edged sword, though. Research also has a way of reinforcing these identities, sometimes in negative ways, right? Race, for example, is socially constructed. When we always and reliably use race as a category in research, which we need to do to understand relationships, it also reinforces those ideas, which sometimes have a rigidity and support problematic approaches to communities and people. So the point here is that the way that research interacts with intersectionality, with these power dynamics, is very complex and quite powerful. So addressing this in the context of health research, I want to point out that this intersectionality, these power dynamics, are inherent to health and health research, right? Sometimes we do certain types of health research or evidence-based practice programs, which seem to be pretty independent from some of these power dynamics in society. And they usually aren't. If you dig deep enough, you will start seeing relationships. I mean, it's hard to think about expensive procedures in the absence of class, for example, right? But what I will say about health research is you can be guaranteed that, if you're talking about health, you're also talking about power dynamics, because health in and of itself represents a power dynamic, right? People who have health issues have a particular place in society where, there are different types of stigmas that are associated with health conditions. There's power dynamics that exist in patient provider relationships. Health status itself is an indicator of power. So when we're studying health, we're in some ways studying power and power dynamics as well. It's inherently enmeshed in those relationships. So Well, as I say this, what I would just argue is that we all, all of us who care about health and are working in the health professions need to take this as an opportunity to self-reflect about how we engage with data around different populations and groups and the different types of marginalization and power dynamics and privilege that exist in communities. And challenge ourselves to really think about how we're using that data. Are we using it in a way that really can support all communities fairly? Are we making sure that the voices of people from different backgrounds are being represented? And are we being humble and modest about the limits of our own self-knowledge as we're doing this? So, it's worth all of us doing that and challenging ourselves to do that, particularly for those of you like me who hold a lot of identities that hold a lot of privilege, right? So that's just a question for us all to keep in our minds. So continuing on with this conversation, I want to start off by talking a little bit about the fact that when we talk about power dynamics and inclusion and marginalization in health and health research, we have a tendency to focus in on specific groups being harmed and look at some of the dynamics around that. And that's important things to do and to consider. But I actually want to start out looking at the other side of the coin, which is who has been helped the most by research? Who has had the most advantages from research? Because that's an important story too, right? And it really is based in the idea that, we have a history when it comes to health research where different groups have typically had research really focus in on their needs and priorities, typically over the needs and priorities of other groups, right? And this is so common in research that it's actually really almost embedded in common research strategies. It's in some cases even just expected in research. And this is something that really needs to change, right? We really need to think about how we're going to shift at a fundamental level how we do research in order to really change how this data is informing us. So I'm going to talk about two different examples of this that talk about fundamental patterns in research that sort of determine what questions that get asked and how they get answered, which are who does the research, and secondly, who participates in health research. So we often, when we're looking at research, we often look at the research itself. We look at the papers, right? But we often forget, who is actually the people who are producing research. And this is important because the people who are doing the research are the ones who set the priorities. They're the ones who ask the questions, right? And taking the question of studying who's doing the research gives us insight into what types of questions are being asked and what types of sets of knowledge that are really important to understanding health issues are perhaps being ignored, right? So one example way of thinking about this is to think about faculty in the United States. Now, not all research is produced by faculty at universities, for example, but a lot of the research is produced through higher education and faculty members. So we can use that as a proxy for thinking a little bit about, who's doing health research. So if you look at tenured professors on the whole in the United States, there's about 1.7 male professors to 1 female faculty members. There's 7.8 white faculty members to every faculty member from an underrepresented minority identity. And that would be 50-50 for gender, and if that were representative, that would be about 1.8 white faculty. So no, 1.6. So it's point is that it's very skewed in terms of the number of faculty that are from backgrounds that hold a lot of privilege, right? This is also true. I found some data for nursing faculty in particular, in 2016, and about 16% of nursing faculty are BIPOC faculty. And if that were actually represented the population as a whole, that would be around 40% of faculty as a whole. So we're seeing an underrepresentation of folks who are essentially in charge of producing research, right? So what is the problem with this? Well, there's a lot of problems with this, right? I think it's important to note that research thrives on the imaginations of the people who are doing it, that our ability to see an idea, a problem, a challenge clearly involves being able to see it from multiple directions. And when you have, a large portion of people who are doing this research, doing studies who are from privileged backgrounds like myself, right? There is a element of blindness that we have, which is that very often when a society is structured around serving our interests, right, and we don't necessarily always see, when the spotlight basically is on us, we don't always see what's happening outside of our own sphere, right? This is not true for faculty from marginalized backgrounds, right? In the sense that people from other backgrounds, they have their own knowledge of their experience from the group that they come from, as well as the perspective from dominant privileged culture, right? Because that's the whole system is set up around that. So you get greater insight, right, from having multiple perspectives included in the imagination that leads to research. So point here being that diversity among people who are doing research impacts the research questions that are asked. And if we don't have that, it can skew what's the information that's generated towards, communities who have greater power, when we're talking about these types of health issues. There's also a way in which, the need for diversity of researchers also means that people should have opportunities to be able to ask those questions. People should have opportunities, regardless of their background, to be able to engage in these questions. And I think that we need to take that seriously as we think about ensuring that everybody has training so that they can go and pursue a career doing research on health-related issues. So, this is an overall loss for research and understanding the scientific process because, we need those multiple perspectives in terms of, having good science that can really help everybody in our community, right? So there's a question around who participates in health research as well. So you have the question of who's doing the research, who's asking the questions, but also who gets to be studied, who gets to provide their input and their experiences to our literature that tells us about health research. Now, the truth is, and what I'm going to tell you about shortly, is that a lot of our health research has not traditionally had very diverse populations that are being studied or samples in the studies. Now, there's some reasons for this, and some of them are actually scientific, and I want to explain why there's some people argue to explain this, right? The truth is that there are some empirical advantages to studying homogeneous populations, right? It's much easier to detect difference when you're looking at groups of people that are pretty similar, right? So imagine if you go into a school where there's required school uniforms. If somebody walks into that school with an orange shirt, it's going to be really easy to pick them out, right? Whereas if somebody shows up at a school that's highly diverse and there's no school uniforms and somebody shows up with an orange shirt, you're not going to notice them. They're not going to be detectable. And the same thing is true about how diverse or similar your population is that you're studying. For a homogeneous population, differences are much easier to detect. So you can have a smaller sample size. You can also have a stronger effect, so you have a better relationship between the independent variable and dependent variable, which maximizes internal validity, which increases your chance of getting published and seeing an effect if there is an effect. So there's all these real advantages from research to not study diverse populations. But the problem with this is it decreases external validity. It means that when the data that we produce is less useful in the real world, and it doesn't apply to populations who are not being included in that research. And that's a challenge. Now, you can make reasonable arguments in some cases for research to choose to have a homogeneous population. But the problem is when that becomes a pattern rather than an exception, right? If you keep on doing that over and over, you start creating a literature that is really skewed in terms of the views that and experiences that it captures. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an example of this from the behavioral sciences. Now, the behavioral sciences are a little different in terms of their sampling and their questions that they ask than other health research. Of course, behavioral research in terms of psychology and other considerations relates to health research, but there are some differences there. The reason I'm talking about behavioral sciences is that there's actually been some good work challenging what has been done traditionally in this field, and they've actually done some great work talking about that and trying to actually work on those problems. So it's helpful to talk about this a little bit. I'm going to talk about one paper that looked at this that I think is pretty interesting for demonstrating the problem. And it actually really generated a lot of conversation. There's a review in 2010 which looked at analyzed the publications over 4 years in the top psychology journals. They looked at all the papers and sort of analyzed them based on who was being studied. And they found that of those papers, 99% of the papers were published by people from Western universities, and 96% of the participants were from Western industrialized countries. Now, those folks actually only represent about 12% of the global population, right? So what that's saying is that the people being studied are not in any way meaningfully representative of our global population, right? But they're very often used as a standard for understanding behavioral health or behavior, right? Another interesting study looked at samples from looked at the papers, and they found that in studies in America, 67% of them in behavioral research were only composed of undergraduates in psychology courses, right? Entirely a very narrow range of folks, right? So this is an issue, and it really highlights what are called, it's a challenge called essentially the problem of weird samples. Now, what weird samples refer to is the idea that some samples are not representative in that they overrepresent people who are from Western backgrounds, people who are highly educated, people who are from industrialized nations, people who are rich, and people who are from democratic countries, right? So that's what WEIRD essentially stands for as an acronym. Now, this is a problem because again, it tells us that the information we're gathering may not be represented, and this is just an example of how weird samples also produces weird results. So, studies this is an example of income maximizing offer, which is a measure of how people respond to people who make an offer in an exchange, right? And when that offer is high, what they found is that people in the United States tend to really punish other people who make an initial offer that's really high. However, if you look at that behavior across other cultures, that turns out to be very different than how other communities respond in those negotiations. Now, the problem is that the vast majority of research has been done in the United States. So it's just taken as accepted that it's just natural and normal based upon that evidence base to punish that behavior. So that it was just taken, it was assumed that this was just human nature. But when you look at this in the larger populations, you see, no, there's nothing about this that's human nature. It's just, a cultural phenomenon, right? And that's part of an example of how, by having samples populations that are not representative, can really throw off our understanding of health issues, our understanding of health behaviors, our understanding of health disparities, all these different things that we need to understand to address some of these real inequities in health practice, are sometimes those inequities interact with the fact that our data that we're working with is not usefully representative or diverse. So again, the idea here being that weird samples are often taken as a norm or normal, right? And groups that don't fall into that norm, that group are sometimes treated as the exceptions, right? And even when they represent the global majority, right? So, the other thing which I think is kind of interesting about this dynamic is that when you take a majority group that has a lot of privilege, and you just treat it as the average or normal, we don't actually turn around and study those groups and say, hey, are there characteristics of people who are wealthy, for example, that are important to understand about them as a group in terms of how they behave and how they interact? And are they actually the ones who are different that we should be studying and understand why they're behaving in certain ways that maybe are not to the advantage of the overall public, right? So, how we accept certain norms and who we take as standards is going to be really important for the evidence base that we're working with. Now, when we talk about health research in particular, and the biases that come into health research, they actually have a lot of similarities to behavioral research. It tends to be a little bit more diverse in terms of populations that are studied, but overwhelming, you still find that studies, there's people are majority white, wealthy, educated, urban. A lot of studies, particularly historically, were men, although that's changing and sometimes reversed now. But this can be a really strong bias. For example, I'll talk about later the fact that when we look at clinical studies, which is a subset of health research, but for clinical studies, white folks make up about 90% of the samples of the people who are studied, right? But if you were doing that based upon just population averages, that should be 60%, right? So, that's a big problem, right? That you have such limited diversity in our clinical trials that we're trying to understand these important questions around. So, what are the implications here? Well, the implications for research are that when we do studies, and the populations being studied are not diverse, well, the information is most relevant to that study population, so they benefit more. They get more from research. It does more for those communities. This, in turn, further reinforces power and privilege to those communities, right? So it's a cyclical process, right, where it's supporting itself, right? And those power dynamics, again, a cycle that needs to be disrupted. It also means that it can lead to misunderstanding of health issues and create poor interventions because it's based upon populations and perspectives and experiences that are not representative of our communities. And it can also produce generalizations that can actually harm marginalized communities, right? So if you have studies that are based on the assumption that people have a lot of resources, right? And it's a study where it assumes everybody can have a Fitbit or high tech innovations, right? Well, is that going to work well for everybody? Well, no, that can actually cause harm in terms of creating poor interventions or misunderstandings or creating things that are not relevant to the groups that we're working with. So, just to summarize here, there is an issue that research is not divorced from culture, and it has real significant cultural implications. What is produced, the questions that are asked are really influenced by the viewpoint of the researcher themselves. And when those viewpoints are limited, we're sort of impoverishing our understanding of the important richness and complexity of health issues. That we can, when that happens as a system and as a pattern, it disproportionately advantages certain groups. And it creates an invisibility to this whole process, where we often again focus in on marginalized groups and their challenges or needs, and we forget that there's other groups that have advantages and benefits that have put them in a different situation, right? So it's important for us to also reflect that this coin has two sides, right? And that we need to look at both of them equally. So I'm going to turn to talking a little bit about the other side of this question: is how does research interact with folks from groups that are marginalized in our with respect to power dynamics, right? The first thing I would just say is I'm going to talk about some concerns and problems with health research that has occurred. But I do want to point out from the outset that health research has tremendous potential for benefits. And there are many folks, many of whom who are from marginalized communities, who said, hey, look, I find these health disparities, these inequities completely unacceptable. I'm going to go and do research to show that this is a problem. I'm going to go do research to essentially change the system. And this can be incredibly powerful for changing political systems, changing what we do in health, because it can help us to recognize health disparities that exist. It can help us find out what the needs are, right? It can help us figure out what strategies are actually effective for changing things in terms of health to benefit folks most effectively. And it can also reveal and illuminate the voices of communities that are being marginalized, right? So it's an incredibly powerful tool. So I'm not wanting to say, but to any way imply that research itself is a bad thing. What I will be implying and showing is that there are many ways that research can actually make situations worse. And if we're going to approach research ethically, we want to be responsibly think about those different potential harms and avoid them, right? That's how we begin to shift these practices, shift these inequities that we're seeing. So again, research has the power to both the ability to shift these power dynamics. As I just mentioned, it can have positive impacts, but it can also change, have negative impacts as well. One of them is that it tends to solidify certain categories or groups. And it can tell stories about groups that are marginalized that may be to their disadvantage, right? So I'm going to talk through some of those different types of problems that show up in health research that I've seen, that have shown up in the literature, and that are actually avoidable if we take a careful planning approach. So the first I should just mention is, when it comes to research, we have to think about research ethics as a whole, ensure that people are being treated well in research itself, right? So I've talked in other contexts about research ethics and approaches that we can use to ensure that there's appropriate consent, that people have a voice in research, and that we can engage with it responsibly. And there's, as we know, this horrible history of marginalized groups being harmed. For example, research among prison populations where work that wouldn't be seen as acceptable in the general population takes advantage of vulnerable prison populations, right? There's also ways in which research can contribute to group stereotypes and result in stigma being formed for groups. An example of this that I think is really important for us to keep in mind is like the politics of people's body size, right? There's a lot of research looking at body weight that uses terms and uses approach that's actually very stigmatizing towards people of different body sizes. And I'm not going to go into the details of this, but we know very clearly that this has caused stigma, caused discrimination in the healthcare system that is really painful and harmful. And it comes out of, in many ways, out of the research, the way that research is presented, the way that folks are essentially dismissed in those studies. Another thing that I think is important to note about ways that research can cause harm is when you start identifying a group with a problem, a health problem, there can be a slippage where you start to then blame the health problem on the group or blame the group for behaving in certain ways, right? So example of this is HIV, right? So there was a transition between learning, doing research that showed, a higher prevalence and risk for HIV among gay men, and then increasing stigma and harm and blame on those groups that actually made the whole situation worse when it came to health and health impacts. So that's another way that you can sort of identify a problem for a group, perhaps with the intention of helping that group, but then actually making things worse by then associating that group with that problem. And if people choose to then blame that group for that problem, it can be a big issue. Another challenge that we see is that there's a tendency to focus in on problems, right? When you start identifying a group only with problems and forgetting about the fact that groups and communities, any sort of culture or community has real strengths, has real ways in which they're empowered, has ways that they support each other, has advantages. When you take a marginalized group that is being harmed, often by systemic discrimination in our society, and then you just focus on the problems for that community, you create this distorted view in research that can be harmful to that group, right? And this, again, connects to that last point that I'd have here around the fact that, there's a tendency to focus in on, behavioral expectations instead of systems-related factors, right? So we can say, hey, in this group, they're eating this way, or they're doing this certain practice or whatever that might increase their risk for disease, and ignore the fact that there are a range of different economic, housing, other types of factors, healthcare access issues that might be causing this problem. And we focus on changing the individual, changing the behavior, when really the thing that needs to change is a systems level problem. Another thing that we see come up in health research is actually research that has harm to group identities. Now, an example of this is for Native American communities, genetics, and the way that genetics has been used to define and sometimes tear apart different communities based upon the way that genetics defines whether someone's a member of a tribe or not in some context. And there's huge debate whether, how that should be used, how that should be thought about, and how that affects, even sort of traditional and tribal knowledge about the origins of communities of their tribe. So, these are things where the scientific process itself can challenge and alter group identities, right? So that is something that's important. And this can also come into, in a similar example, how we think about the use of knowledge and control of narratives. So again, many Native American communities are very concerned about the way that there's a tendency for researchers to take knowledge, repackage it as their own, redescribe it, and then tell a story about a tribe or a practice or something like that that may or may not match their needs or their way of approaching talking about this issue. And there's this disassociation where it feels like research is taking from them something and redescribing their experience or their knowledge in a way that isn't appropriate. And that can cause harm to communities. It can also reinforce sort of different socially constructed identities. An important example of this is race. So you're actually required in research to collect, very often to collect information about your participants based upon, standard categories of race. But in doing so, you create a situation where you reinforce race as being a real biological thing, as opposed to being socially constructed thing that's very fluid, has a lot of different meanings, and is very complex, right? And it allows a situation where we start talking about race as racial groups as distinct in important ways based upon higher prevalence of a disease or something like that. And we do need to know that information, but it's also true that that can create a mental framework that increasingly marginalizes and separates groups. Okay, and that's a challenge too. That's a problem, right? There's another issue here around, shifting in power with respect to medical authority, right? With research and defining something as, as a medical concern rather than a social concern, it changes who has control. So schizophrenia in many cultures and historically very often was seen socially as a spiritual or cultural thing, right? And had those other sources, right? Research changed how schizophrenia was thought about, and essentially medicalized that state, right? Now, when you medicalize something, you give people in healthcare authorities, a lot of power, right? So they get to say, they get to define what the condition and state is. It gives them control over people, right? So when something is medicalized, people get put in the position of being patients. Now, when you start getting in the role of being a patient, you're expected to do certain things to change your behavior to meet the recommendations of the medical community, right? And that's a problem when you start talking about groups of folks, right? So we need to think about how this research actually influences those power dynamics. Health research can also influence access to resources, right? When we find, there's different things that you can find out about groups where you pit different marginalized groups against each other and say, well, this group is having, more problems in this area. We're going to divert resources in this direction. It does make sense from a utilitarian perspective, but it can also create situations where you create conflict or pitting folks against each other. And sometimes, depending on the quality of that data, it can actually have real negative impacts for communities, right? So, there are things that come out here. Now, I've given a bunch of different types of examples here, but the truth is that there's many different, these things are complex, and there's many that I haven't mentioned here that can show up in research. And as we think about this, I really think that it behooves us to have an open mind towards this and accept as our responsibility to think carefully about these different elements of the research project more broadly, not just the collection of data, but generally in terms of what different social factors influence how research occurs. So this really involves us stepping back and saying, all right, who's going to be served by this study? Like, why does this study exist? Why are we doing this health research? Who's the relevant stakeholders here, right? For those relevant stakeholders, particularly if those stakeholders are marginalized in some way or another, be it due to their health status or their membership with the community, what opportunity do they have to actually contribute towards creating this question, towards addressing this, right? who, given that they get to say something about this, is what they're saying actually getting heard, right? Do they get to have a role in the overall conversation? Do they get to help make decisions about what goes forward and what doesn't, right? As we look at the data, what's going to be studied, are there pros and cons for that impacted population? As I mentioned, research can have positive and negative impacts. We have to think just as, we often assume that learning about a health disparity, for example, is going to have positive impacts, but that doesn't have to be true, right? Depending on how that gets used and what that context is, it may have negative impacts as well. So we have to look at the potential negative impacts and try and avoid them as much as possible, right? So these are some things that we want to think about in a broad context as we approach an area of research. Now, we can also look at this in a concrete way with respect to specific studies, right? So we can look at papers or sets of papers and ask these questions too. So, going through the trajectory of a research study, we could think about developing a study question. So we could think about who gets to have creativity here, decide what the questions are, are the people who are doing the study, are the researchers, do they have a background to give them insight into the population, into the problems that they're looking at? Should those researchers be, have a broader background? There was a recent uproar about a set of guidelines that came out around an issue around race in nursing, where none of the people on the paper were people of color, right? And all of them were white. So the question is, should we have, when we have these studies, should we have diversity among our authors, among the people who are creating the study, who are contributing imagination to this, and have backgrounds and experiences around this, around different perspectives. We also would look at the design of the study. So we need to be very careful about what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are for the study. This is going to be really important for determining who gets to be part and have a voice in the study and to be participants. We would look at their processes for identifying participants. How did they recruit them? How did that sample come to be? We also want to look at questions around, were there any benefits or barriers to entering the study? Were those benefits and barriers likely to be different across different groups? Are there expenses tied into being part of this study, being part of this research, where some folks might not be able to be involved? These are questions we have to ask pretty much any study that we look at. We'd also want to look at how data was collected itself, right? So we get some information about what data was collected by looking at the demographics, the sample, the participants in the study. So you should always look at that chart in any paper. We also want to look at their processes. Did they collect data in a way that might be more or less likely to exclude or repel certain groups, right? So if we have, if we're studying elder populations, and we are doing work, we're using a computer-based survey or a cell phone-based survey, well, we're going to have potentially serious impacts in terms of who gets involved in that study. We can also look, based upon how a study progresses, whether certain groups dropped out of the study more frequently than others, particularly when we're talking about clinical trials. We can also look at the quality of data. Did certain groups, was there a higher response rate among different groups, or did they fill out more of the questions? And a big question here that we need to look at when we're looking at the data collection methods is, did a study fail to ask important questions? Or did they ask in a certain way that was biased, right? Did they ask in a way that could reinforce a certain framework for understanding a cultural issue or a health-related issue, where they really should have pulled in more information about other elements to this that would be important to the community, particularly a marginalized community that they're working with? You would also ask questions about how data is analyzed. So did people make an honest effort to consider their biases before this? And that gets to some of the reflexivity in qualitative research. Also, who gets to be the one who interprets what the data means, right? Who is a researcher who's deciding what's important, what isn't, and what themes to emphasize? And also, is there any data that might actually, if you take a critical view to it, maybe it suggests a different story about what's going on there? We can sometimes see that in studies when we look at what's being said. If we take a critical look at it, we might say, oh, you're suggesting that this is due to, somebody's individual behaviors, that they aren't behaving in this certain way. But actually, the data suggests that this is because of, for example, a systems issue, right? So we can sometimes reveal that and see that in the studies that we read. We also want to look at how people write up these studies. How did they report it? Is in the research and the way that folks are being talked about, are they being talked about respectfully? Are they being talked about in a way that doesn't speak down to them, that doesn't recognizes their strengths, right? That doesn't describe them as deficient. You can actually see that in a lot of research, and I think that is a red flag when we think about trying to create a research body that can help move us forward around these disparities and marginalization that sometimes is reinforced by that research. You can also ask the question of who is seen as being able to provide a solution to research, right? Based upon this research. Very often, research, it's suggested that, the solution to this is that, some system or some person in power is going to solve that problem for the community. Can we also look at possibilities where the community can solve that problem themselves, right? Can we view other ways that people get empowered based upon this research? We can also ask the question of, does the study have important implications for a group? Does it do things which might, essentialize or oversimplify that group, right? Could that potentially lead to discrimination at some point if it's misrepresenting that group or presenting an idea that maybe some research, while true, can actually present a group in a negative light, and that's actually pretty important to think about as we do these studies. Did we, if we saw differences between groups, particularly a marginalized group and groups in power, did we talk about what those differences are in the context of the literature? Did we actually think about what the evidence says about those relationships? Or did we just say, well, we'll just make the general assumption that this is just a power dynamic issue that is just there. And we can just assume because someone is part of this group that they would have more negative health impacts here. We actually have to do the work to think about why this is occurring, what the evidence says about that, and not just looking at behavioral factors, but also the system factors. And then secondly, we tend to focus on differences between groups, but we also want to focus on similarities as well, right? Are we also giving fair due attention to not overemphasizing differences between groups to make a point, but also recognizing that many people are the same, and that we don't have to always view along all dynamics view groups as separate, right? And that gets to the way that research can contribute to essentializing identities, right? And that can be a problem. So the overall point here is that research can actually really have major benefits for folks and address some of these major disparities, but there's major and consistent problems that we see in terms of impacting marginalized groups. Now, we also have ways that if we sit down and we think about research we think about what has been done, we think about the methods, we think about what it means in the larger picture, we can actually prevent a lot of these problems, right? We can actually start to shift research practice to have, make it less likely to have negative impacts and maximize those benefits, right? So it really requires us all to take that seriously and take it on as a responsibility to do that. So getting to the idea around adopting strategies to improve health research and improve equity in health research. There's many opportunities to do this, right? And a lot of them are what I just talked about in the previous section in terms of raising our awareness, around these types of challenges, identifying resources that can be contributed to changing research, to making sure that scholarship is more diverse, and creating policies that help commit us to actually doing this more effectively, right? So there's a lot of different ways to do this. I'm going to talk about two kind of distinct examples around this. One is at a systems level, which is a very high level sort of example. Another is at a community level, so more of a grassroots type of approach. So systems level approaches can be really important here because, as we know, a lot of these major health issues, health disparities that we're facing, that are major contributors to mortality in our society that you see every day in the clinic, a lot of these come from basically systems and patterns that are very meshed in our society. Now, if sometimes even what seem to be very simple procedural changes, a change in a policy here or a law there, can actually make very big differences for how things are done. Now, these could be policies or procedures, guidelines, structures, etc., but things that change the system in which we're working to essentially make it more fair and make access more equitable. Now, this can happen institutionally. It could happen, at a hospital or in a community organization. It could be a local, policy or something like that. It could happen in the region. It could happen in the state. It could happen nationally. It could happen internationally. These systems changes can happen at many different levels. But they are really crucial for adopting a justice-centered, focused approach to research. So one example of this is the 1993 Public Health Service Act, which was a really important step where, based upon IOM research showing the really crucial impact of health disparities in our population, it required all research to actually include plans for how it was going to include in recruitment women and minorities, and that information, that plan, had to be in their proposals, and that they have to justify any exclusions where groups are not being represented. And this includes a requirement that they actually have to analyze and track that data as well, right? So this was a systems change in that by requiring this of all funded research, it shifted what research had to do. So they had to ask that question. They had to check that box, right? And again, getting back to the idea that there's an overrepresentation of people with privilege among the people who are doing research, it acts as a check to make sure that people are asking this question. Now, what impact did that have? Well, it's, this is a correlational study, so you can take it with a grain of salt. But studies that were funded by NIH as opposed to so there's two graphs here. One is studies that are funded without NIH support, so they're funded independently by outside organizations. That's at the top graph. The bottom graph is clinical trials that were funded by NIH and had NIH support. And this goes from 1993 until 2018, and it looks at the percentage of minority participants in clinical trials, right? Now, what you can see in this graph, again, is correlational, but what you can see over that time is that for NIH-funded trials where researchers had to do that work, representation substantially increases. whereas it didn't or it didn't have as significant of an impact um, for studies that were done without NIH support. Now, that being said, that's one message of this, and that's suggesting that this policy-based, systems-based approach actually did have an impact. Now, did it have enough impact and did it solve the problem? No, it didn't. You're still seeing that in clinical trials, only about 10% of participants are from minority backgrounds. It should really be about 40%. So we have a long, long way to go, right? But what it does say is that it's improving, right? And there are other things that need to be done. There's other ways to enforce this better, et cetera. But what it is saying is that these systems levels decisions, making people check that box, can make a difference. Another example of this is looking at gender. And the NIH created a policy on sex as a biological variable. They're using sex in the binary sense. I know that's sex and gender are much more complicated than that. It's an issue with research, but for the purpose of this study, one of the points that was being made is that in order to be able to distinguish if there's a health-related difference, particularly in the context of history where research very often only focused in on male participants. So a lot of our understanding of cardiovascular disease, for example, comes from exclusively studies that were done exclusively among men. The assumption being that, because they didn't have a hormonal cycle, that they were better participants or more homogeneous participants, therefore they could produce better, that the data would be better, which is not true. That history means that a lot of practices were based on an unrepresented sample. So what this is trying to do is trying to encourage studies to measure gender for studies for both animal and human participants. And what we see is after the enactment of that policy, collecting that led to studies that were more likely to study both male and female participants. Again, this is correlational, but it is suggesting that starting to integrate these systems-based approaches might actually force the research enterprise to start shifting in terms of the way it does things. There's also community-based approaches, and these are really quite interesting. I think that these studies are really shifting to focus in on the grassroots level. How do we change the way that we engage with communities around health, right? And it recognizes that these communities have different needs and desires with respect to research. We can't come into communities and say, you have to do things this way. We're going to do this study on this topic that we're interested in, be it, glaucoma or diabetes or, whatever happens to be that the researcher wants to study. We want to, it's important for us to engage with understanding what your needs and desires are for research. It's also important to note that for a lot of communities who've been marginalized, research has really been tied in with history's discrimination, colonialism, right? So, the approach that's used in research may be, the ways of knowing what counts as knowledge, who owns that knowledge, is often very much framed in Western perspectives, which have certain biases, right? Wherein, for example, the researcher owns the knowledge once it gets transferred, and other communities don't feel that way, right? They don't feel like that's how it should be done. They also don't trust researchers that they will use, that they're good stewards of this information. So in this context of distrust and, a history of harms to communities, we need to think about other ways to do that. And one strategy that's been used is community-based participatory research. And this is an approach generally that emphasizes the need, preferences, knowledge, and perspectives of the community in doing this. Now, there's a bunch of different kinds of approaches to this. There's community-engaged research, there's community-based participatory research, there's action research, There's a lot of different names that are used to this, and they come out of a range of different traditions. There's a long history related to civil rights and South American activists, and innovations in terms of flipping power dynamics in education and other contexts that have led to these perspectives. But this history has essentially argued that we need to flip how we think about things, so that instead of doing what is called parachute research, where research comes in, extracts information from a community about a health issue, and then departs and you never see them again, and basically leaving the community feeling like they were just used, right? Instead of taking that approach, we switch to having a more engaged approach. So what does this look like? Well, CBPR, as one of those strategies for engaging with communities, does a few different things. So it recognizes that a community has an identity, right? That they are important, that identity requires respect and acknowledgement in the research that's being done. It also doesn't just focus in on the weaknesses of community, right? It also looks at what are their strengths, what can they be proud of, how have they weathered the discrimination that they faced to produce amazing things despite that discrimination, as opposed to just focusing on the ways in which they've been harmed, right? And using that as a way of defining their group. Another goal is to create meaningful partnerships. And to do that throughout the research, not just at the end or not just at the beginning, and then ignore them after you gather data. A goal would also be to integrate knowledge and action, right? So it's not just producing knowledge for the sake of knowledge. We're also thinking about how can we produce knowledge that can actually be helpful to the community. The community should have a voice in what information is created, so that the information that's created actually will be useful to them, right? As opposed to doing things that just happen to be in the interest of the researcher to study some topic that maybe is abstract to that community and maybe will have no meaningful benefit for them. Another one is to have a process where people are learning from one another, where it isn't assumed that the researcher has all the knowledge about this health issue and the participants or the community organization that they're partnering with is just providing participants to answer their questions, right? That there is actually a relationship, there's a wisdom that's recognized on both parties, where we can work together to get better information, right? And that the process for that engagement recognizes that there's social inequities, right? Researchers have a lot of power because of all the privilege that very often they have. And we need to create a process where participants can actually feel empowered to be equal partners there. It also requires a process that is cyclical, that it isn't a one-time deal. You come back and you engage in ongoing discussion. When you approach your health-related issue that you're trying to understand, that it looks at some of those positive elements that I talked about earlier, and then also that it doesn't just view, a single level, that you use an ecological perspective, that you understand that issues for community also exist within systems at state, national levels, organizational levels, etc., that can influence what's going on, and it's not just a behavioral issue. And that requires knowing and having a relationship with those communities to understand those relationships. And the other thing is that, when you generate the information from the study, that you actually give that information back to the community, that you don't take information and study it, publish it in journals, and then the community never learns what you actually finds or get benefit from it. So here we're trying to switch some of those power dynamics to create a research approach that can benefit people. And this can be used, these principles, these strategies can be used for qualitative research or quantitative research. We can really use them and learn from them. And, our hope is that we could use as many of these as possible, but even integrating some of these strategies and some of these ways of thinking into any research can lead to real benefits for communities, particularly marginalized communities that are experiencing discrimination and the after effects of colonialization, and all those historical impacts that are really important and have reasonably real trust issues with researchers. So in summary here, when we think about different strategies for addressing inequities and marginalization in health research, there's a lot of opportunities that we talked about initially around, part of this is a commitment where we think about the research that's produced and the questions that are asked, and we analyze when we're doing evidence-based practice, we analyze carefully what information we're using and how we're applying it, and who the populations were that were involved in that. But we can also do things at systems levels to change what research is done, how research is done, expectations for it to change the process. We can also, at a grassroots community-based level, we can also change the way that the relationships that we have with participants in research, the way that we think about what research does, how it gives back to communities, as opposed to an extractive process. So those are some things to think about here in terms of some different ways, just a couple examples of ways that we can improve research. So let's return to the idea that we're not just doing research, we're also thinking about evidence-based practice. Research is important for knowledge, it's important in and of itself in certain ways, but what we care about as health professionals, to a large extent, is what does it do in the world? What sort of impacts do we have from it? Now we have, of course, the evidence-based practice process here, which you're all familiar with, of asking a question, finding literature, and coming back. But I want to emphasize that we also want to step back from that sort of abstract idea of what evidence-based practice is, and remember that this is how we improve. This is how we make change, right? This is how, when we look at those, in Snohomish County, we look at 10 years of disparity in lifespan. 10 years is a lot of years, right? Those disparities, when we look across different areas of Snohomish, those are for reasons. A lot of them are race, a lot of them are wealth, a lot of them are these different social factors. We can't accept that. We need to be able to understand what's going on, and we need to make changes in the health services that we offer, the research that we're applying to essentially change health practice. So it's a very real, it's a very concrete change that we're making here. And it looks abstract, but it really is not. So what types of things can we look at as we're doing evidence-based practice? As we're going this process of finding papers, analyzing them, creating programs and implementing them. Well, there's a lot of them. I'm not going to talk about all the different things that we can do, but we can think, for example, around carefully looking at how in these programs that we develop, do the benefits and burdens of this practice or this change that we are suggesting fall equally across groups? Does it ask more? If we're going to offer a new technology, for example, in our clinic, does it ask more of people who have less resources than folks who are relatively more privileged, right? So we can ask those questions. Similarly, if we're making a change, is it possible that those changes can actually increase health disparities? Is it going to improve them or decrease them? Using the same example, it's very common for new health technologies actually to increase health disparities, right? Because people who can typically afford new health technologies, as nice as they might be, tend to be relatively privileged, right? The other thing to think about as we're designing these programs is, are we thinking about beyond behaviors or practice changes in the clinic? Are we also thinking about the systems that constrain this health issue, right? Are there sociopolitical factors and systems that we should also be addressing in this practice change, right? Is it something that we need to be acknowledging explicitly in the programs that we develop, right? Do we need to change practice at our institution so that there are certain policies that have more equal benefit, right? Another thing to think about here is stakeholder engagement. So people communities, folks who have a real interest in this change. And again, it could be various groups that we and different types of power dynamics and marginalization. But very often, for almost any health issue, you're going to have people who are experiencing that health issue that you're dealing with, whether it's cardiovascular disease or oncology or any sort of health issue that you're dealing with, right? So you want to think about, if we're creating a new plan, how can we engage people who might be impacted by this change? Can we talk to people? And of the people we talk to, are we actually getting diverse viewpoints, as we think about making this change, so that we can do a better job of ensuring that everybody is able to benefit from it? And again, attending to who's most marginalized. Do they have a meaningful say in giving input to this change? And is that actually considered in what choices are actually ultimately made? Another one is just thinking about procedures. So if we're going to create a plan, if we're going to create a program, what do we want to look at? So when we make decisions, are we basing our change based upon recognizing that the research that we're using, does it actually have the same diversity of the people that we're serving in our program change? Do we have ways, as a program is implemented, that we're actually holding ourselves accountable to equity, right? So that we're keeping track of this, that we make sure that doesn't get lost in conversation, that we don't just charge forward without doing this. So can we create checkpoints in our process to make sure that we're looking at equity? I also like to say that when we create programs, we also look at the people equity for the folks who are having to do this. I think this comes up very often in nursing because nurses are very often asked to take on yet one more project, yet one more responsibility, and sometimes that starts becoming inequitable. So we have to think about our programs in terms of equity for the people who are actually implementing it as well. When we're carrying out this program, this intervention, we want to make sure that our staff, people who are doing it, have been trained to offer it fairly, to make sure that everybody has access to this new program or service. We also want to make sure that if we're measuring, how successful this program is, that our measurements, the data that we're collecting, actually has some measures that lets us see if we're having issues with equity. Right? Because if we want to look at equity and maintaining it over time, we want to track that. We want to be able to see if, we're able to, if it's made a change, 2, if our program is actually affecting people equitably, and 3, if we can maintain that over time with that program. All right. So, when we think about evidence-based practice, practice change is, one of the biggest implications of health research. It's the major reason that we do health research is actually to advocate for our patients, make their lives better, and change health systems for the better. And one major way to advance social justice is to take the same attention that we might take to research and apply it to these health programs in our process of analyzing the research that exists to create programs that are equitable and fair and allow everyone to benefit from the new knowledge that we're trying to integrate it into our improved practice. All right, well, that's about it. I'm going to wrap up here, but what we talked about here again was the fact that research has these huge implications, that it isn't abstract or unrelated to socio-political realities and inequities that we see in society. That this is history where health research has disproportionately benefited privileged groups, and that there's ways in which it can benefit marginalized groups as well, but that, we need to be very careful to ensure that we don't further reinforce different types of harms that can occur in those situations and have historically occurred. We also looked at some examples of things that we could start doing, and there's of course many more, but to think about different ways that this could be addressed to create more equitable research, and also think about some questions that we might ask ourselves as we're trying to apply research to change our practice. So, pulling back again, we have a real challenge in healthcare for ensuring that the benefits of research, the benefits of what we do, affects everyone equally. That we have everybody has a chance to gain the benefit of new knowledge that we're transmitting, and that requires us to self-reflect, be humble about what we know, and to force ourselves to, as much as possible, make sure that we're asking the important questions around equity when we develop research and analyze that research to change practice. Thank you very much for listening. Hope this was helpful. Take care and be well.